flights can be really fun, but they're actually also really polluting and don't move that many people. So we need to find better, more environmentally friendly options, and as I'm sure you can guess, transit has a big role to play, in particular high-speed rail. It's important to give people a sense that air travel is just not nearly as high capacity as rail travel, all the way up the stack. A good example of this is the Airbus A380, well known as an impressive engineering marvel and the largest passenger airplane in the sky, and yet its maximum passenger capacity in its densest configurations is only around 800 people. By comparison, large high-speed trains can push well above 1,000 people, and the A380's days are numbered anyways. At the same time, airport facilities need tons of space. People generally need to queue to go through security, but also to pick up baggage and wait for their flights, as well as delays, which flights are a lot more susceptible to than train travel, where you can show up just 10 minutes before your train departs and walk right on. This means that in an airport you need to provide massive buffer room for when people are waiting or queued up because you can't move them quickly enough through one stage of the travel process to another. Of course, that's for a number of reasons, not least of which is that trains are long and slender, and so you can board them from many points at once, whereas with a plane you can board from only a couple of places at once. Of course, the airfields that airports are located at themselves are also absolutely gigantic, which makes locating them hard and locating them close to the places people actually want to go to even harder. And if you want to expand capacity, it can be incredibly difficult, as we've seen with Heathrow, for example. But probably most importantly for us, with the future of flight, it's going to be difficult to electrify. Now, progress is already being made today on this issue, and so I don't think it's impossible to electrify flights, but it's going to be incredibly difficult just because of the way that modern turbofans work and the energy density of batteries. We're easily decades away from climate-friendly airplanes that can compete with modern jets, and that means that getting people off as many flights as possible is the climate imperative. So we need more high-speed and intercity rail. And not just within countries, but across borders, as well as natural barriers to connect up various countries and cities around the world. But how many people can we reasonably expect to move with high-speed trains? And is there really a hope in replacing flights? Let's talk about it. To start off this video, I want to tell you something that I find helpful that doesn't really have to do with public transportation, but it does have to do with talking about a challenge as big and often intimidating as replacing flights with high-speed rail journeys, especially for a person like me who lives in a place where there is sadly no high-speed rail. I think the reality is that when you look at flights, it's going to be hard to replace some of them. New York to Cape Town isn't getting a rail line anytime soon, nor is Cape Town to Frankfurt. But that doesn't mean that there aren't tons of flights that we could get rid of tomorrow, or that we definitely should be trying to get rid of in the next couple of years. Often today, a lot of flights already exist in corridors where high-speed rail or even competitive electric intercity rail is an option. Right now, the world actually does have a lot of high-speed rail. Now, if you're watching this channel, you probably live in an English-speaking country. You may not, but you probably do based on my YouTube analytics, which means that you probably don't have all that much experience with high-speed rail, since English-speaking countries aren't very good at getting it built. But believe it or not, a lot of the world does have high-speed rail. Want to go from Paris to Frankfurt, or Madrid to Barcelona, or Beijing to Shanghai? All of these trips are doable on high-speed rail. Even in the English-speaking world, trips like London to Manchester or New York to Washington, D.C. are already compelling to do via electric train. Now, all of these are corridors where we should be looking at how we can eliminate flights because there are already good potential carbon-neutral transportation options for the corridors. Of course, part of that involves strengthening intermodal connections, because oftentimes a flight from Washington, D.C. to New York might be to get on an international flight in New York and head somewhere else in the world. Replacing that short hop from Washington, D.C. to New York with a high-speed rail journey is a pretty good idea. And while of course not every journey between cities is as fast or convenient as it should be or could be today, so much is already possible. Today in 2022, you can get between most major European cities on high-speed or at least electric rail. I think few things show this quite as well as a recent video from Simon Clark, which I'll link up here, where Simon travels from around London to Trondheim in Norway, which is thousands of kilometers, all using efficient electric intercity trains, many of which were not even high speed. Simon does mention that it's more expensive and slower than flying, but it's also more comfortable. And all of this should get better over time. New high-speed rail lines which are already being built should make trips faster and more convenient. For example, in Simon's case, the Fehmarn Belt tunnel between Denmark and Germany would probably already make this trip quite a bit faster. More competition between rail operators thanks to open access, as well as more capacity and more complex networks, will also open up more seats and ideally also more affordable fares. Of course, we should probably also be regulating and taxing short-haul flights a lot more to reflect the negative externalities of all of those emissions. And we could use funds or revenues from such charges to help enhance our intercity rail infrastructure. And of course, similar trips like the one I just described can be done all across Europe, with more and more different rail services and corridors being opened up every single year. Now, while almost never international, a ton of rail journeys can also be done in East Asia, with extensive high-speed rail networks already existing in China, Japan, and Korea, which connect a lot of the corridors where people could regularly travel by flights. China in particular connects so many of its cities with high-speed rail that reducing flights should probably be a higher priority, akin to what you see in Europe. At the same time, less appreciated, there are some fledgling new high-speed rail lines and networks popping up around the world. For example, in recent years, the first high-speed rail line in Africa opened in Morocco, connecting Tangier with Casablanca. That service is known as the Al Barak. In the Middle East, Medina, Jeddah, and Mecca in Saudi Arabia have all been fairly recently connected with a new high-speed rail line. Make sure you're subscribed down below so you don't miss a future video talking about these lines and their potential to be expanded into larger networks serving North Africa and the Middle East. At the same time, perhaps unsurprisingly, Turkey is building out a really large high-speed rail network that is arguably the first intercontinental system of its type. It actually uses the Marmaray Tunnel, which links the European and Asian sides of Istanbul with high-speed rail as well as super high-capacity metro-style trains, and that's a really interesting network in the future as well, because eventually the Turkish network could connect the European high-speed rail network to a theoretical future Middle Eastern one. There are also corridors like Amtrak's Northeast Corridor, and numerous other intercity corridors in all kinds of places around the world where we don't have world-beating high speeds, but because of the direct connections of rail are already competitive with airlines. And these corridors have massive future potential for upgrading and improving them to make them even more competitive. Now, I know it's been said before a lot, but it bears repeating just why high-speed rail is so compelling when compared to flights. And it's important to remember that just like with metro systems or bus rapid transit systems, high-speed rail is done differently in every single system. And so countries should try to learn from one another to take the best bits of every system and put them together. That also means that there's massive potential for improvements and more passenger traffic on our existing high-speed rail infrastructure. One of the best known benefits of high-speed rail, as I already kind of alluded to, is that unlike with flights where you go from one crowded, uncomfortable airport to the next, with sometimes a nice airport mixed in, you can go from city center to city center. But a less appreciated element that's still super important with high-speed rail is the fact that you can also go to other destinations, because railways are networks. Want to travel from one city to an international airport in another city so you can get on a flight to go somewhere else? That's possible. What about traveling from a suburban center of one city to a totally different city across your country? Also possible. For example, if Stratford near London ever received a Eurostar service, it would be incredibly well connected, and people living there wouldn't necessarily need to go into London city centre to access high-speed rail services. But also, people who potentially could easily connect to Stratford via other rail services could also access those international high-speed rail journeys, massively expanding the pool of potential travelers. I actually talked about this recently in a Substack article, which I'll link down below. Of course, there's other options as well, like through running high-speed trains onto conventional lines to reach smaller cities and towns, like you see in France, or like was at one point planned in the UK with regional Eurostar. This is something the US should really learn about with the Northeast Corridor, where there are a lot of potential extensions off of it where you could build an electrified line that might not be high speed, but that would still connect a decently big city. Now, prices for tickets can vary widely, but they don't need to be higher than for flights, and they probably shouldn't be if we're pricing in all of the carbon pollution that is caused by flights. Plus, trains have more capacity, and we can make sure trains are full more of the time by enabling more walk-up and incidental trips that wouldn't be practical with the long security and trek across an airport, but are totally practical with people waiting in the city center station for a seat to free up so they can head to another city. The other benefit is that with a rail journey, a single seat can serve several potential trips. For example, a trip down the Northeast Corridor could serve a trip from Boston to New York and New York to Washington, D.C. Alon Levy has an excellent article on SNCF and yield management and some of the interesting details of high-speed rail in France, so I'll link that down below. It gets into a lot more of these details. Of course, the ability to be more flexible with trips by rail doesn't just have to do with the trains and the rail network. It also has to do with the fact that trains can run incredibly frequently, as you see in Japan, where high-speed trains between Osaka and Tokyo, as well as other cities, operate every couple of minutes. Trains are also obviously almost always more comfortable. Seats tend to be more spacious, but you also can stand up and walk around or go get some food. And the vehicle itself doesn't jostle around nearly as much as a plane, and it also doesn't have that crazy vertical acceleration you feel when you have turbulence. You're also much less likely to get confined in a window seat between two sleeping passengers when you're on a train journey. And you don't have to wear a seatbelt at all times. On top of that, given the logistics of the fact that trains tend to be on the surface or in some fixed infrastructure, it's a lot easier to provide them with high-quality internet connectivity, which is super useful in today's modern, flexible work world. Want to take a trip for a few days to another city? You can work on the train. And honestly, I personally find it a lot easier to work on trains. Not only do you tend to get more space at your seat, and you might even get a seat at a table. So things are just more flexible. Not Just Bikes actually has a video up here talking about the incredibly compelling nature of high-speed rail in Italy in particular, where the network has grown massively in recent years and probably even killed Alitalia, the airline. That all being said, while high-speed and intercity rail already replace a lot of flights, there is massive potential for them to replace far, far more. That's for a number of different reasons, but one that I'm sure a lot of people will want me to mention is price. Indeed, in some places on some routes, prices are really high, and that often stems from a lack of competition or inefficient operations. For example, if you look at some of the most expensive high-speed rail journeys, like for example the Eurostar, you'll notice that it's the only option on that route. In mainland Western Europe, on a lot of international routes between different countries, you can now choose between different carriers. For example, if you want to go from France to Spain, you might be able to take a train from SNCF or from Renfe, which is a really good option. Of course, it's also important to make sure that you don't build excessive high-speed rail infrastructure and you try to keep its costs reasonable. Otherwise, there's a tendency to take capital money from elsewhere and plug it into the high-speed rail network, which hurts your overall rail connectivity in your nation. The same is obviously true of service. Having a bunch of parallel high-speed rail corridors might seem great, but if it means that each one gets that might mean less compelling trips overall. And it might mean your local or regional trains, which are essential for connecting people to high-speed corridors, can't operate very well either. That's why it's so important that with infrastructure as expensive as high-speed rail, we should try to keep costs down by looking at leaders like Spain, for example. At the same time, this infrastructure should be used as intensely as possible. Trains every few minutes is a sign of success. Part of this is also providing a variety of different fare options, because seats that go empty don't help anyone's bottom line. Intermodal connections are also a huge issue. Connecting to the city center is great, but not everyone lives in the city center, and I'd argue in many cases most people don't live in the city center. While this is less of a concern with high-speed rail networks in places like Europe, the construction of new high-speed systems in places like North America really does need to consider this. For example, Texas Central's high-speed rail line between Houston and Dallas won't be connected with the greatest transit networks, as discussed by City Beautiful in a video. And so thinking about how these terminals can be connected to other destinations is really important, because high-speed trains can be really big and move a lot of people, so you need transport capacity from the terminus to other destinations. Of course, you also can't make a high-speed rail journey if you can't get on a high-speed train, and we're in need of so many more high-speed rail corridors around the world. In Europe, clearly some key connections are needed, and a lot of them are being built. A great example of this is Rail Baltica, which will connect a number of the Baltic states to the rest of the Western European rail network with standard gauge tracks, allowing for more seamless journeys across Europe. At the same time, crossings in difficult geographical areas like through mountains and water crossings can be great places for rail to pick up a lot of mode share, since they're such difficult places to traverse and there tends to be limited options for people to cross. Examples for this include the many base tunnels being built in Switzerland and Austria, but also fixed links across waterways, for example from Estonia to Finland, from Germany to Denmark, and potential future intercontinental connections like from Spain to Gibraltar and across to Morocco, connecting the Spanish and Moroccan high-speed rail networks. We should also be designing networks to enable more long-distance service. For example, the lack of a direct connection between HS2 and HS1 will make international trips connecting to places along HS2 less attractive, since you'll have to transfer in London, making the trip by plane more attractive. There's also obvious corridors where high-speed rail still doesn't exist, and it should be built. A great example of this is in Brazil, between Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Curitiba. And if international rail services could be figured out, probably all the way to Buenos Aires. Of course, many cities in India are also soon going to be connected by a high-speed rail network, and what's exciting about this is the world will finally have another massive high-speed rail market comparable to Europe or China, where more technical solutions and rolling stock can be developed. Now, speaking of networks in Asia more broadly, they need to probably densify on the busiest routes, providing redundancy between major cities, and they should also probably eventually interconnect like you see in Europe. Now, I know the political and geographical challenges will make that difficult, but again, the same things are true in Europe, and so it's probably conceivable that eventually it happens. Standardization of things like gauge and signaling mean that eventually, someday, you might be able to ride a high-speed train from a city in India into Southeast Asia, which really would benefit from a dense high-speed rail network, all the way potentially into China and beyond. Now, you might think that long-distance trips by rail are unattractive, but I'm not so sure. When you consider the regulation of long-distance journeys that could be made by rail but people choose to make by flight, pricing should be competitive on high-speed rail. It's also worth mentioning that given the fact that trains are so much more comfortable than flights, if people are willing to make a 10-hour flight, I can't really see a good reason they wouldn't be willing to make a 10-hour train journey, which with high-speed rail could still take you a very, very long distance. At the same time, the return of sleeper trains but in high-speed form seems like a really, really interesting opportunity. An overnight sleeper on a modern high-speed rail network could easily take you the kind of distances that you see with long-distance international flights, so that's a really exciting idea. Of course, there's also no reason not to link smaller cities that have substantial travel demand between them with independent high-speed rail networks that might not be connected to a larger international high-speed rail network. For example, Sydney and Melbourne are a place where I think a high-speed rail line actually makes a lot of sense. If a cost-effective design is used, the price shouldn't be too crazy. And Australia already has a really strong culture around riding trains, and so it does seem pretty reasonable to me, especially as carbon pricing and the like gets more aggressive. Even smaller cities could make sense with high-speed rail connections if the connections can be built super affordably. Calgary and Edmonton both have about 1.5 million people, so the populations aren't huge, but a connection between them would be mostly flat, and so it should be able to be built inexpensively. Of course, something that can sweeten the deal, especially if you can't fill all of that capacity with intercity trains, is to allow some regional trains to use the high-speed tracks to help fill them up more, like you see on HS1 in the UK. Speaking of HS1, we should really be looking at how we can use existing infrastructure better. There are lots of flights between Paris and London every day, despite the fact that HS1 exists. To some extent, maybe the number of flights allowed to fly between Paris and London could be connected with the amount of people using HS1. If demand is super high on HS1, you can allow some flights to happen to relieve capacity. But if HS1 isn't full, we probably shouldn't be sending people across the channel in jetliners. The ultimate goal here, though, is just to limit unnecessary flights, which will help us slash emissions, while we improve our high-speed rail networks by improving their convenience, capacity, and connectivity. And eventually make the status quo in the Netherlands, where there are no domestic flights, the international norm, with far less short-haul flights and far more high-speed rail. Thanks for watching.